From the studios in Joplin, Missouri, Good News Productions International presents Venture in Faith. Outstanding Christians of our generation telling their own story of how God has worked in their lives. Your host, Boyce Moten.
The 11th chapter of the book of Hebrews gives a long list of the great heroes and heroines of the faith. The 12th chapter of Hebrews seems to intimate that they are watching us. We are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses. Then we are admonished to lay aside every weight and the sin which doth so easily beset us, and look unto Jesus, who is the author and finisher of our faith. One of the modern speech versions translates those last two words as pioneer and perfecter of our faith. We're delighted today to have in our studio Charles and Roberta Selby, who are indeed pioneers. They have been working for the Lord in the Philippine Islands since 1947. Charles and Roberta, you came from Nebraska, is that right?
That's right.
And your grandparents were pioneers who came from the east to mid-America and staked out a homestead? What do you know about your
That's
grandparents?
right. My grandparents came from Germany, my mother's parents. My father's parents came from Ohio, but their ancestors came from overseas also. So they were all pioneers.
And they lived in real crude circumstances?
My mother was born in a sod house in Kansas.
Made all sorts of sacrifices?
That's right. When we were growing up, they made all sorts of sacrifices, as I recall. We lived during the Depression years in Nebraska, and my father was a farmer there. I think yours was too, wasn't it?
Before the Depression, and then your father had to change occupations?
My father changed occupations right at the beginning of the Depression and the Dust Bowl. But we were there during the Dust Bowl years, and he had to leave the farm. He and Mother bought a restaurant and ran a restaurant. Dad said he never made any money in the restaurant business, but he fed his family, and that was one thing that many families didn't do very well. Especially Roberta's folks had a very hard time, along with many others who were still on the farm during those years.
And you actually led your wife to Jesus Christ. You were high school sweethearts?
That's right.
You might be interested to know that she's the only girl I ever went with.
Well, praise the Lord. That's a credit to you both.
But we, of course, didn't have an automobile to run around in, and didn't have any money to go anyplace. We went to church together. That was the main place that we went when we went together someplace.
Charles, when did the thought occur to you that you would be a preacher of the gospel?
Probably very seriously when I was a senior in high school. But even before that, I can remember when I was about 12 or 13 years old. A man who, by the way, has been pretty well known in Missouri, E.O. Hewitt, who lives over here in
Willow Springs.
In Willow Springs, Missouri, and preached there for many years. He was my home church preacher up in Nebraska, and he baptized me when I was about 11 or 12 years old. And I told him at that time I was going to be a preacher when I grew up, but I kind of forgot that. But when I became a senior in high school, we had a preacher who came to minister to several churches in Clay County, Nebraska. None of the churches could afford to pay a preacher in those Depression years. And so this man preached at 4 different churches, three different churches every Sunday. He preached two of them, or sometimes 3 of them in the morning and another one at night, on every Sunday, traveling 9 or 10 miles between services. And it's probably significant that he was the son-in-law of the daughter of Leslie Wolf, who had been a missionary in the Philippines for many, many years and was still there when he came to minister in our home church. So he had married the daughter of Leslie Wolf, one of the great pioneer missionaries in the Philippines.
That was Bob Hansen, and he baptized me. And then when we went to the Philippines in 1947, we were one of 3 families, and Bob and Eleanor Wolf Hansen was one of those families that went with us to the Philippines.
And your sister became a missionary.
Yes, Marge Boudreau. She came to Ozark Bible College and then later on came over to the Philippines and joined us there in the work, particularly in teaching in a Pari Bible Seminary.
So childhood sweethearts give themselves to Jesus Christ, to one another. Then you go away to seminary.
Right.
Those were tough years too, weren't they, Charles?
Yes, they were.
Those were the years of the war, hardship, rationing, and but at that time you were thinking of pastoring or preaching in the United States of America, not a missionary.
Right. Never really considered being a missionary at all during our years of training.
All right, now explain to us how that came about.
Well, after we graduated from Cincinnati Bible Seminary in 1945, I was ministering to 2 small country churches in southern Indiana and preparing to go to summer school and take graduate work, beginning my work for my master's degree and my Bachelor of Divinity degree. And in June, just about a month after we graduated, or maybe just a few days after we had graduated from seminary, my brother, I had one brother, and he was killed in training in the Army in Camp Fannin, Texas. And so we moved to Nebraska so I could be near my folks during that time. And I ministered to 2 churches out there. And in 1946, we got a letter from a missionary in the Philippines. Evidently our name had been given to them because they did not know us. But there was a young woman who had graduated from the seminary at the same time, well, not at the same time, but she had been in the seminary with us and had gone over to the Philippines about a year before we went. And she must have given them our name because they were looking for 3 missionary families, possible missionary families. And we were one of those families that they wrote to. And I wrote back immediately and told the missionary that we weren't interested in going to the Philippines. And because I was all prepared to go back for graduate work, and I was intending to do that.
But we did pray about it before.
We did pray about it, yeah.
Oh, I have to insert here that it's kind of interesting that when the Lord told his disciples to pray that the Lord of the harvest would send forth laborers into his harvest, that he sent the very men who were doing the praying.
That's right.
And I'm not a Greek scholar, but I do know that the word translated as send is the word ekbalo, which means to cast out or throw out. And almost every time it's used in Scripture, it's used with violence, like cast out the bondwoman and her son, or Jesus casting out those that bought and sold in the temple. And so a lot of times people who begin praying about missionaries find themselves so uncomfortable at home that they have to go to a mission field. Was that your experience, Charles?
Perhaps that had a lot to do with it. A lot of things happened in those years that we weren't aware of, but as we look back upon them, the Lord was doing a lot of things in our lives. And we were doing things that we really didn't realize it. I do lots of preaching these days about walking by faith and not by sight. And a lot of that I've learned, the significance of it. I've learned in these late years. But as I look back, we were doing that even without being fully conscious of it, because we really didn't have any idea what
God had in store for you.
Yes, and what all was involved in leaving family and friends and going to a foreign country. And we had one son. He was probably 8 months old when we made our decision to go to the Philippines. And when we first appeared before the church that has supported us all of these years, the Indianola Church of Christ in Columbus, Ohio, has supplied our entire family support all these years. When we first stood before them, a young couple with a little 8-month-old boy, those people have told us since that they said to themselves, are they going to take that little boy? over to the Philippines, all that way into a foreign country and into situations that we don't know anything about. I remember so clearly when I saw some slides. This missionary from Manila came and showed slides in my father and mother's home to us and had some slides of Apari. And my father leaned over to me when we were looking at those slides. He said, "Son, what are you getting yourself into?" And I said, "I don't know." And I didn't. I had no idea. And I'm a fellow that really did not like to travel. I didn't like to go places. I wanted to be a homeboy, you know. And yet there was just something that it just seemed so natural. As I look back, it just seemed so natural that we were going to go to the Philippines.
So the first letter, you got a negative reaction,
Right.
no. Well, and then there was a transition. You prayed about it, one thing.
That's right. And of course, she was probably doing a lot of praying about it that I didn't know about. And you'll get the reason why I believe that in just a minute. We came home from church one Sunday night. We lived in a little parsonage right next door to the church building in Clay Center, Nebraska. And we came home from church that Sunday night. I went into the little room that I used for an office. And lying on my desk was a paper they called the Manila Christian. And in that Manila Christian was an article written by Brother Faustino Pinera, who was the one preacher, really, that was working in the Cagayan Valley, in the area where we were going to go. And he titled his article, "Come Over into Macedonia and Help Us." And I read that article twice, at least, that Sunday night. Roberta was sitting out in the middle of the living room floor, just outside of my office room. And I called to her and I said, "Roberta, how would you like to go to the Philippines?" She said, "I've been ready for a long time." So she'd been doing some praying probably about that, but hadn't said very much about it. And so we wrote another letter to this same fellow and asked him to come and see us and speak to the church. And he came on December 22nd, 1947. And we made our decision that day to go. On January 19th, it was in December 22nd, 1946, that man came and spoke at Clay Center. 3 weeks later, January 19th, 1947, we had our entire family support promised, beginning with January 1st, 1947.
And six months later to the date,
Right.
we landed in Manila, June 22nd, 1947, which was almost unheard of in those days to go that fast.
You know, when pioneers start out, you can't take everything that you want to with you. You maybe have a wagon and a covered wagon or something. You put a few essentials in there. And I'm sure when you got to the Philippines, you had to make do. What kind of a house did you live in, Roberta?
Well, it was just a wooden house that they had torn down out in the country because our town had been bombed completely at the end of World War II and had not been built up. So they found an old house out in the country, the Filipinos that lived there, tore it down, brought it in, and rebuilt it and put a grass Nipa shingle roof on it. And that's where we lived for the first 3 years we were there.
No electricity.
No electricity, no running water. No bathroom facilities inside, all that sort of thing.
Did you have to boil the water that you drank?
Yes, we did.
And you had a child that was by now how old? Just
A
little
year. He had his first birthday on the ship while we were going across the Pacific Ocean in June 8th, 1947. Right.
But somehow God has protected you and your family through all the experiences
That's
of 41 years. This is the time this interview is being conducted. It's 1988. 41 years so far.
Right.
So far.
And you're anxious to get back, I'm sure. And before we conclude this interview, we'll be talking about one of the dreams that you've got now. But when a pioneer, and I've always admired pioneers, they come to a place and stake out a homestead. There are probably no towns, no hospitals, no schools, and they just start doing things. And one of the first projects that the Lord led you into was a Bible seminary.
Right. Brother Pinera and I, Brother Pinera was 55 years old when we got there. I was 26. So we were about like father and son. And we traveled together up and down the Cagayan Valley in the first 3 years that we were there, trying to find Christians that had been scattered everywhere during the war. Many of them had lost their lives. Chapel buildings that had been in existence were destroyed sometimes. And we were able to pull together about 10 local congregations during those first 3 years. But that was a time of assessment, really, as I look back upon it. And we came to a conclusion during those first 3 years that what we needed more than anything else was preachers, and not American preachers. We did not have any thought of coming back to the United States and recruiting American preachers to go over there and evangelize in that area. We felt that we needed Filipino preachers. Filipino preachers who could go to their own people in their own language and in their own culture. And we believe that that's the way the world is going to be evangelized. If it is ever evangelized, it's going to be done not by American churches sending American missionaries. We need American missionaries, no question about that, but we don't need as many as a lot of people think we need, because if every missionary would go to the mission field prepared to train the people on the mission field to preach the gospel to their own people in their own language and in their own culture, we would accomplish our goal in a much quicker time. And I think that's the way it's going to be done. And so I'm encouraging Bible college students everywhere to prepare themselves now to prepare others to preach. And that's what we tried to do in Apari Bible Seminary.
And it was begun in 52?
Yes, we began it in 52 after our first furlough. We came home after 3 years, and I went around, talked to churches, preachers, elders, members of the church, and said, do you think it's advisable for us to establish a Bible college? We felt altogether inadequate to establish a Bible college and began teaching. But, as Roberta said on our radio interview, we were the ones that were there, and Brother Panera and Roberta and I were the first teachers in that Bible college, and it's been operating now. This week is our commencement week of our 36th year of operation of the Bible
We've
college.
graduated somewhere between 250 and 300 from that school, and they're active now in all phases of our work. And it's really seeing our dream brought to fulfillment of training a Filipino leadership.
Jesus had 12. And look at the running start that you've got now with so many.
And some second and third generation.
Yes.
I tell my students, if every person, if every one of them could multiply themselves by 10, if every missionary could even multiply themselves by 10, that is, train 10, that's what I would like to do, is train 10, and those 10 go out and train others. And it just keeps on going. How fast would we be able to reach the Philippines and eventually the whole world if we would operate in that way?
What was the next dream?
After that, when our graduates began to get out into the field, we realized they had nothing that they could leave in the homes of the people that would teach them New Testament Christianity. And so we had to have printed material, nothing in the language of the people. And so our new graduates began to write tracts. And we established a small printing press, began to publish tracts, and they used those to leave in homes and pass out during open-air evangelistic meetings and so on. And we've gone on to publishing a Sunday School Quarterly. We publish a church paper somewhat comparable to the Christian Standard and other things, and do a lot of printing, of course, for the schools that we've established and so on. But the printing press has been a very important part of our ministry. I think that there are people who can be reached through open-air evangelism, through house-to-house evangelism, but there are some people that can only be reached through the printed page, where they can sit down and read it in their own house with not feeling threatened by their peers, and when they see or read that or have somebody read it to them, then they send for a preacher and say, I want to know more about this.
I've been told that Karl Marx said, give me 26 lead soldiers and I will conquer the world. And of course the lead soldiers he was referring to were the letters of the alphabet and the genius of the movable type printing press. You're pioneers since 1947, living in primitive circumstances, starting out dreaming of a Bible college. The Bible college became reality. Faith has a way of calling things which be not as though they were.
Right.
And the next dream was of a printing ministry, and that printing ministry is a reality and has been for
That's right.
many, many years. But you continued to dream. What was the next dream?
The next major thing that we became involved in was the establishment of 2 Christian high schools. And there's where we really learned what it is to walk by faith. I'd like to just share that with you, just briefly. We wanted to establish, well, I should go back a few years when we needed a new dormitory in the seminary. We were renting an old building, and the owners came and told us that he couldn't rent it to us the next school year. And we had a few months that we could find something that we could rent or build. We couldn't find anything that we could rent. We did own a piece of property that was very swampy, but we were able to fill that with sand from the seashore, and we live right on the seashore, so we didn't have any problem with that. And so we decided to build a dormitory. Our problem was that we didn't have any money to build a dormitory. I did have enough money to hire some men and put in foundations for a dormitory building for the boys. And so I hired those men, told them to put in the foundations. I told Roberta, well, if we can't build that building for another month, another year, at least the foundations are going to be well cured out. And then I had enough money. When we got the foundations in, I had enough money to buy the posts. So I told the carpenters to prepare the posts to put them up. And by the time they got the posts ready to put up, I had enough money to buy the girds to hold them together. And so we did that. And then I had enough money for the floor joists. And by that time, after that, I had enough money for the trusses on top. And then enough for the galvanized iron roofing. And just step by step by step, the money was just there when we needed it. What we did, we started out with what we had. We took what we had and started out. And the Lord supplied what we needed as we went along. And I think that that's the way the Lord works. And so when we came to our 2 high schools in 1967, we were going to build 1 high school. And again, we had no money to build a high school. But we had purchased a piece of property in a remote barrio where we had a church, had been a fairly old church, one of the first 10 that we had there. And but we didn't have any money for the building. We paid for the property, but didn't have money for the building. And we had told the people there that we were going to start a high school there. We hadn't even applied for a permit to start a high school. We had to get a government permit to do that. But then one of our preachers came to us from the southern part of the province of Isabella and said that the mayor of the town had come to him and asked him if we could establish a high school in that new town that was coming into existence. And he said, if you do, we'll give you a piece of land to do that. Probably about 5 or 6 acres of land that he was going to give us if we would establish a high school there. And the Army was in charge of that area because it was a resettlement project of the old Hucks, the Hucks that were trying to overthrow the government back in the 40s and 50s. And establish a communistic form of government. And they had surrendered and they were resettling them. The Army was in this resettlement project, in charge of it. And the Army colonel said to me, if you're going to put a high school here, you've got to do it this year. So I went back to the other school and other place, and I told the people there, well, I guess we're going to have to postpone the establishment of a high school here because we've got to get that one started this year. And one of the old elders came to me and he said, if you don't start a high school here this year, I'm just going to have to leave this place because I've told everybody that we're going to have a high school here this next year. So we established 2 high schools. We didn't have money for 1, but we did just like we did with the dormitory. I hired 2 sets of carpenters, sent them down, told them put in the foundations, and just like that, the Lord provided what we needed. And we had those high schools ready to go with the permit for both of them from the government. From between February and June, we did that. Now, that's the way the Lord works.
If you've got 5,000 men besides women and children to feed and somebody gives you 5 loaves and 2 small fish, do you complain because you don't have enough, or do you lift your eyes to God and be thankful? Well, Jesus was thankful for what he had, and they kept using it and using it and using it, and pretty soon everybody was filled and they had 12 baskets
That's where
full.
I get that principle, you know.
They
took what they had.
They
They didn't wait
thankful.
for it to be multiplied. They took what they had and started out, and the Lord provided what they needed as they went along. And that's the way we built our dormitory and our 2 high school buildings, and a lot of other things that we've done over there.
And you kept dreaming, because pioneers look around and you say, we need this, we need this, we need this. Here in an established community, we don't need the pioneer spirit perhaps as much as you did in the Philippines.
That's right.
So after the high schools, what next?
Well, we became involved in radio broadcasting because another tremendous evangelistic outreach. There are people you can reach that way that you can't reach in other ways because they can sit in their own private home and listen to the radio broadcast. But I also understand they can reach over and turn off that radio broadcast very easily if they don't like it. But those that listen will respond. And I know in the early years of our radio broadcasting, I know that there were 12 churches that came into existence as a direct result of our radio broadcasting. Everything we've done has been aimed at reaching souls for Christ, even our high schools. In our high schools, now we have 3 high schools now. We established a 3rd high school in 1986, just 2 years ago. And our high schools have resulted in well over 3,000 young people accepting Christ, besides many of their parents and their relatives. And we've established a number of churches in the areas where those 2 high schools, or the first 2 high schools were located. And in the new one, the same thing is happening. And evangelism is the point of everything that we've done.
So you moved into radio, and I presume almost everybody has radios in the Philippines?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I'm impressed. You think sometimes you go to a primitive culture and you'll find people with transistor radios and so forth.
One of my favorite pictures is a boy riding on the back of a water buffalo, a carabao, out in the middle of a rice paddy, with a radio at his side and headphones on, listening to the radio while he's plowing or something.
And you, excuse me.
He has a dream of having our own radio station. That's one of the visions of the future that we have.
Praise the Lord for dreamers.
Yes.
I've got to say this poem. It's one that I don't know the author, but it talks about the pioneering spirit and dreamers who are sometimes ridiculed by their contemporaries and called fools. So the poem says, "Thank God for fools, for men who dare to dream beyond the lean horizons of their days, men not too timid to pursue a gleam to unguessed lands of wonder and amaze. Thank God for fools. The trails that ring the world are dark with blood and sweat where they have passed. And they are the flags of every flag unfurled, their ashes and oblivion at last. Thank God for fools, abused of low estate. We rear our temples on the stones they laid, and ours is the prize their tired soul might not wait. Theirs, the requiem of the unafraid." Well, as I hear you keep talking about dreams and laying a foundation and planning for the future, I'm reminded of that poem and of the beautiful spirit that makes it possible for young people to build upon foundations laid a generation before. So you got the radio program, that's a reality, and the radio station at this point is only a dream. Right. But the dreams continued on.
Right.
Now what was next?
He had a dream for many years of a children's home. And finally in 1977, we were able to start a children's home, and today we have 91 children in that home. And even though that might not be for the purpose of evangelism, it results in it because we contact their relatives. They have a church in that home. Many of the children have been won to the Lord. And of course it means that many children's lives have been saved, children who might be dead if it weren't for that children's home. And we have the added joy of being grandpa and grandma to 91 kids in the children's home.
Roberta, I want to talk about something. I hope that it's not inappropriate, but sometimes missionaries, in their zeal to save other people's children, lose their own.
Yes.
And you almost had that experience in your own family, didn't you?
Yes, we have 3 sons. And at one time, our oldest son was away from the Lord, and he was over in Vietnam. And at that time, I was suffering a great deal from migraine headaches. So I spent a lot of time in bed, and of course, that gave me a lot of time to spend in the Word and in prayer. And I prayed so much for him. And I even asked the Lord how to pray. And he gave me this prayer: Lord, don't let him rest, but just continually prick his heart and cause him to remember the seed that's planted there. And I know it's there because I planted it there. And that's exactly what the Lord did. Years later, when I was sharing this with Lloyd, after he came back to the Lord so strongly, he said, "Boy, Mom, that's just what happened." And now he's over in the Philippines working with us. A wonderful asset to our work.
This last Lord's Day, our church studied James chapter 1 in the first 10 verses. And that's the passage, if any man lack wisdom, let him ask of God, who giveth to all men liberally and upbraideth not, and it shall be given him. But let him ask in faith, and so forth. Well, that's a confirmation of this principle, and perhaps an encouragement to some of our viewers who may be going through the same or similar problem.
Yes. Never cease praying for your children.
Now, there's another dream that's burning on your heart right now.
Right.
And do you want to tell us how the Lord is leading you in the next venture in this pioneering field?
Well, this last year has been a very, very trying year for us, and also a very revealing and inspirational year in many ways. Roberta, I have mentioned before that Roberta fell twice this last year, and I don't want anybody to get the idea that she's getting old and stumbling around. Her problem is she moves too fast, and sometimes because of fast movement she falls. She fell at the seashore and broke her right arm, and a few months later fell on the front porch of our house and broke her
I want the
left
cameras
arm.
to zoom in if you can. You can see a little bit of the scar that Roberta has on her.
This here
It's
shows how it's
deformed.
out of place.
It put pressure on this, and then I had to have this operation later. They took the cast off of this arm and did this operation the same day in October.
I had that done, and that operation was done in Manila, but the broken part was taken care of in a pari without the benefit of good x-rays or anything like that, just to sort of, the doctor just went by feel, and that didn't heal properly. Then she fell and broke this arm and just twisted the bone completely in two here. And she has a pin from shoulder to elbow right now, still in there. She can't lift this arm much more than that. But the problem, the thing that impressed me was that the cost that it entailed to take her to Manila, 400 miles away. We had to get a private plane to come to Apari from Manila and take her back to Manila. And then the hospital bill, the doctor bills, and so on were really quite high. Well, we were able to handle that. It was not easy, but we were able to handle it. But 90% of the people that live in our area couldn't even begin to think about doing what we had to do. And if it had been somebody among the ordinary people of northern Luzon, it would just have had to have gone without any treatment, without any care, and the arm would have become useless. The doctor said that the bones, those two bones, had been grating on a nerve that was exposed, and the nerve was badly frayed. And he said those bones could have cut that nerve, and if the nerve had been cut, she would have lost complete use of her arm permanently. It took us from, she broke the arm on Monday, we got a private plane to pick us up on Thursday, got her to Manila that day, and she was operated on Saturday. Now it was almost a whole week from the time she broke the arm until she was operated on and got it put back together. So I had to make an incision right down her arm here. And the only reason I mention that is because of the impression that it made on me. How many people are there up in northern Luzon that just could not afford to do a thing like that? And what are we doing about it? in March, just before she had her first fall, there were two doctors, two Filipino doctors that had spent a week with us, and they were hoping to operate on many poor people that could not afford a doctor, and they were going to donate their services. They were working with a mission from Baguio City called Project Luke. The hospitals were so inadequate in our area that they could not operate on very many people. One, a dedicated eye surgeon, would not do any eye surgery because of the danger of infection from those operating rooms. And the last thing they said to me before they left was, "Charles, you should establish a hospital here." And I didn't pay too much attention to it. But when she fell, and I realized how many people couldn't do what we did, I began to think about it. And then one right after another, three instances when two men, each 40 years old, isolated cases, they didn't know each other. Both of them had had goiters for years, undoubtedly had not had them taken care of, simply because they knew they didn't have the money nor the hospitals that they felt they could go to and get it done. But they didn't have the money to do it. And so they let them go. Both of them died at about 40 years old. If they had had those goiters taken care of when they were first noticed, those men would be alive. They left their wives and several orphan children as a result of not being taken care of properly. And then a third incident, one of our former students, a woman whose husband had been shot about 5 or 6 years ago by the NPA, the New People's Army, shot and killed. Her daughter, a couple of years ago, was killed in an unusual accident in the town of Apare when a motorcycle with a sidecar on it, that's our taxi, turned over and she was thrown out on the pavement and her head was crushed. So this woman had lost her husband and lost her daughter. She had a son who was married, and his wife was in childbirth. And this woman brought that daughter-in-law a long distance on public transportation, suffering in childbirth with complications, to a little hospital. They kept her for about an hour, said we can't do anything for her. They sent her, she came to another little hospital in Apare, and they said, the doctor said, we'll do what we can do. They gave her a stack of prescriptions and said, go down and buy this medicine and we'll see what we can do. She went down and found out how much the medicine would cost and whether or not it was available, then came to us. She found out that it would cost 1,000 pesos. That's $50. She came to us, I want to borrow 1,000 pesos, and she told me the story. And we gave her 1,000 pesos. She went back downtown, bought the medicine, went back out the hospital, and her daughter-in-law was dead. Now those three incidents, along with hers, convinced me that the Lord was telling us we've got to do something. These people, none of those three should have died if they'd have had proper hospitalization, proper medical care at the right time, and didn't have to lay down money up front. They would have had that done earlier. We need a hospital. Those people will pay their bills, but they need treatment when they need it, not sometime after they are able to find the money to get it done.
Charles, our time has slipped through our fingers. We've got just a couple of minutes left. And I'm going to ask you, if you will, to look into the camera, and you'll be looking right into someone's eyes, and make a personal appeal about being a pioneer for Jesus Christ.
The thing I would like to say more than anything else, to Bible college students particularly, and to preachers and elders in our churches, is that we need to have our Bible college students trained in such a way that they can take the responsibility for training other or people in other nations. Our Bible college students ought to look forward to going to another field, not to become the minister of a church, but to establish whatever it takes to train men and women to take the gospel of Jesus Christ to their own people. That's the answer. And when you do that, the Lord will lead you into a ministry that you can't even begin to imagine, because the Lord will honor your faith. And if you walk by faith and not by sight, the Lord will honor that. And there isn't anything that is impossible to a person who walks by faith. Jesus said, all things are possible to him who believes. And I believe that.
Amen.